My name is Deanna Bowen, and I'm an artist and an educator and a rabble-rouser. True story. Probably don't go with that. Probably don't say that. Okay.
Oh, we're going with that.
My family's pretty scrappy. My family comes from Alabama on my grandmother's side and through Texas and then into Indian Territory and then into Canada. The settlements before they came to Canada were thriving. My family had their own land. They had been there for a decade. We had family members that got teaching degrees and were teaching in the region. You know, we weren't poor by any stretch of the imagination. When our community comes to Canada, we met an extraordinary amount of hardship. The government didn't want us to come, so we got the worst land in very cold, northern, remote areas. My grandfather taught me to look for the clan, and it had a lot to do with his experiences living up in Alberta. My mother's generation also experienced hardship. They were the generation that came to Vancouver and began the urban reality of our family. I grew up in Vancouver and knew about the Shaughnessy neighborhood, and that's where the clan was. And we barely ventured to that side of the town, so because of the fear, right? And there's just a lot of stories about white terrorism in our family. It's been internalized as our battle stories and how we fought back, but the reality is that we are what we are because we have fought so hard to be here. I didn't think I was going to live past 25. I had no goal. I had no plan. I had no vision past 25. Growing up, if I made it to 25, that would be a miracle. If I made it to 25 without a bunch of kids, that would be a miracle. If I made it to 25 and not gone into prostitution, that would be a miracle. That was what my life looked like before art, right? And I moved from Vancouver to Toronto when I was 24 years old, and I started again, and that's how I became Deanna Bowen. I started making metaphoric art for the first 15 years of my practice. I wasn't talking about blackness. I was talking about family, but I was using all kinds of experimental techniques to hide them. Because the stories that I was working through were just so stereotypically violent, they looked like a lot of the representations of black people in contemporary media, and I just didn't want to do that. So after that period of 15 years of not using black bodies, I got to this point of having no other metaphors to use. So I went the other direction and confronted the history dead on, and then went down south and did all these journeys and knit together the genealogy of the family and the history of it. My mom has told me as much, that my grandfather really singled me out to be the one for a bunch of reasons. And one of the things that he taught me how to do was to go to the library and take out books and read. And it got me on this track of just, really valuing the documents and digging more. And gosh, I love being in the library that much. It's just the best thing, right? I'm a horrible nerd. I'm just a dork, really. I love history. I love old people. I love the stories. I grew up with old people. I mean, this whole place is full of old stuff, right? That's from my grandparents, my moms, my aunts. I've lived around the artifacts, the relics of our family history my whole life. And so I wanted to understand, one, the war stories, and then two, how that impacts the family. But the work has always been about unraveling this deeply violent, religious, dysfunctional family. Always. That's the reality of my practices. It's not necessarily about art per se. At some point at the beginning of doing the genealogical research, this is a conversation between me and my grandfather. And recognizing that he had singled me out to do a thing, and I cut a deal with him in my head, anyhow, that I would do it through art, because that's what I know how to do. I think that there are many historical narratives that flow at any given time, right? So what we've all been taught is the white British imperialist narrative around what Canada is, but it is not accurate in the sense that it whitewashes a lot, it obscures a lot, and it particularly obscures an extraordinary amount of violence. Because we've all been trained to kind of believe that false British imperialist narrative, we have been blind to so much, so much. And so the National Gallery project is a narrative that spans from my great-great-great-grandfather to the year of my mother's birth. At the end of the day, it's like it's there to do a pedagogical purpose. It's the same as all my other projects. It's grounded in my family's history. The project starts with the first census record evidence of my great-great-great-grandfather, who was born in Africa. And then it flows through the Hudson's Bay Company, it flows through Queen Victoria's tenure, British abolition of slavery, American abolition of slavery, and then I talk about figures that were alive in that time frame, that are relative to Canadian histories. Harriet Tubman ended her last Underground Railroad journey in Canada, so she is a figure that is known in Canada as much as we like to kind of reference her as an American entity. She has very real roots here, and so she needed to be named. Josiah Henson, also known as Uncle Tom, he and his wife created the Dawn Settlement, one of the earliest black settlements in southern Ontario. Benjamin Pap Singleton is an Afro-Indigenous gentleman who created the all-black towns that my family comes from. Why does that matter? Because the last place my family lived on my grandmother's side was 30 minutes from the train station in Indian Territory, a little town called Guthrie. And at the time that they left, there was a major last stand by a gentleman named Chief Crazy Snake. So they would have witnessed it, but it's also important to name him because of the fact that the depictions in the newspaper columns about his standoff frequently discussed Black Indigenous warriors, and that matters for me. It helps me to better understand our relationship, my family's relationship to the Creek Nation. The second half of this piece really starts to flow into Canadian history. So there's the big, long image of the black boy at the center of the piece, which is from 1911 Maclean's article called The Black Canadians, and it was written by a gentleman named Britton Cook. The companion illustration is by Lauren Harris. And so it's important to name the article, which effectively frames us all as being lazy, ignorant slaves, former slaves with no upkeep and no hygiene and all this stuff, and we would just basically loiter around and not work. So what does it mean if Lauren Harris's image is married to this filth article? It's a perfect piece of evidence that kind of starts to roll into other things, like what was the Group of Seven really about, right? And we don't spend enough time thinking about the class realities of these people. These are not poor people that make art. These are very rich people that are making art in reference to British Empire, and they're portraying very particular things. I flow into the First World War, again, because of my family. There's several family members that fought in the First World War, despite the fact that Canada adamantly did not want a black regiment. But I wanted to name that because we were here, and we tried to support a country even though they didn't want us. There's a large image of the Tulsa Massacre in 1921, just as a means to kind of flow through the chronology and really to emphasize what the 1920s looked like. Below that, there is an image of Ku Klux Klan's members in Vancouver's Shaughnessy neighborhood, again, which it verifies my grandfather's narrative of the Klan. We would have been there in the 1920s and would have known about that. And then from there, I flow into the 1930s, and that's really, the peak period for the Group of Seven, right? So I talk about the very infamous photograph of the Group of Seven with Barker Fairley at the center. Barker Fairley is the art critic, German scholar, who basically was one of the bigger promoters of the Group of Seven. And then what does it mean if Barker Fairley is signing a petition that's effectively banning the immigration of black people, which is my family's migration? All of these people willing to sign their name, give their addresses, the place that they work, all of these folks that were just adamant that black people were not suitable for the terrain. But if you read that petition in a different way, it's a map to a community of like-minded people who share ideas. Really, in many ways, that image is kind of central when thinking about the Group of Seven more broadly. They are not a benign group of painters that just come together because they love the landscape. They're actually connected to all kinds of people, and that's the thing that matters the most. And then it flows up to an image of Lyon Mackenzie King at a German Olympics event leading up to the Second World War. Begs lots of questions around why he was there. When we think about the tenure of brilliant Lion Mackenzie King, you have the Japanese internment, you have Jewish refugees coming and literally kind of refusing them entry into the nation. These are all significant things that speak to the racism of the policies of the federal government at this time. All kinds of people have been affected by Laurier, MacDonald, or Mackenzie King. They all were deeply racially biased prime ministers. That's just the fact of that. And the National Gallery cannot possibly be separate from that. As much as we like to think about the National Gallery as being a hands-off kind of a thing, we all know that the politic of the particular prime minister at the time informs what's possible. Eric Brown is the first director of the National Gallery. He's creating the first collection for the National Gallery, and it would have been in line with the politicians of the time and with the royal ambitions of the time. He also established a mandate that effectively has been maintained by every other white director at the National Gallery up until this moment. The whole composition is speaking to the background of the National Gallery and its whole mandate, but it's also, again, speaking to the fact that the Group of Seven were active in the time frame in which my mother ultimately kind of grew into. So she would have grown up with the latter year legacy of the Group of Seven. What I'm doing is contextualizing my family's experience. This is what they witnessed in their lifetimes, and this is what I wanted to put forward. This is the stuff that they've internalized, more importantly. And so being able to manifest it and put it out in the world so that people can see what they witnessed, what they experienced, and it's a means for me to avenge my family, so to speak. I use that language very certainly. They have been wronged historically, and so this is an opportunity to right them in a very real, very public way. I can't express just how profound it is to know where you come from. Right? And I think that people kind of take that for granted, but for this black family, it's a really big deal. It's a really big deal. I don't think anybody would have ever thought that I'd be at the National Gallery telling our story in any fashion, right? But to be able to do that, that is the healing salve. This is a project, that's very much informed by my mother and, about my mother, for my mother, in conversation with the Spider and Louise Bourgeois' mother, and I would say that my piece is comparable in the sense of the scale of, one, the work, but then two, the enormity, the space that my mother takes in my life. We were estranged for the longest time, to be quite honest, and so I started 15 years ago knowing that I was going to be her caretaker. And so part of this is about nailing the genealogy down, because that's what we talk about in her latter stages of dementia back in the day. My mom is no different than other people's mothers who have experienced similar hardship in this nation. It's important to situate all of this within political context, historical context, black experience, white experience. There are undoubtedly all kinds of other communities that will be able to relate, and perhaps out of a fear of never having the opportunity again, I went as big as I possibly could.
Here I am.
Right? Hey, I was here, right? So it's a little bit of that, and it is very earnestly about a desire to generate conversation. I want people to talk about this. I want you to have to contend with it across the street, down the block. I want you to deal with this. This is Canadian history. This is a truth. My truth, certainly. I've been making art within Canada and in front of white audiences for a very long time, and I know how they respond to this history. And so I love this piece because it takes the Band-Aid off, so to speak. And if people are uncomfortable, it probably is because they're encountering something that they didn't know about, and it probably unsettles their own sets of values and ideas about how the world is shaped. Okay, I've done my job. There are other people that are keenly interested in having their histories be heard and acknowledged. That matters more to me than hurt feelings. It is the biggest piece that the institution has ever installed on the exterior of its building. It's a well-researched, solid project. And like I said, I'm glad to put it up there while my mom's alive. The work I do still continues to be about my basic survival. I'm still here. I'm telling you this story. Despite all of that oppression, I still have been able to source the story, tell the story, document the story. The work at the National Gallery ensures that the story will never be lost. I hope that people walk away with a clearer understanding of what racialized and Indigenous people have experienced in the country. I hope that people walk away with a better understanding of white terrorism and the reality of Nazism and the Ku Klux Klan in Canada, ongoing to this day. This is the other thing about the proof notion. If I shaped everything on Black archives, white audiences will say, well, we didn't know anything about that. So what I've done, for the most part, this composition is made of white archival material. And I've been doing that for quite some time because it just takes away that kind of questioning about the certainty or the value or the accuracy of the archive. So let's just take that out of the equation. And so that kind of bibliographic impulse that I have, all of these open source images and how everything is given a citation that's somewhat like a bibliography, is really intended to be a critical pathway for the next generation of researchers. Like my grandparents, like my great-grandparents, I have an eye to the future, and I think about the artists behind me, that I think about the students that I'm raising, right, in my classrooms. I teach them to do exactly what I do, and the stories that they're coming out with about their family histories is just fantastic. And truthfully, if anything, I want to encourage people to know that their family histories can contribute to change. This little black family that they tried to kill off, our story, my remembering of the stories, will enact significant change. All of us can do that.